The water was the color of slate, moving slow and cold beneath the concrete bridge on State Route 89. Officer Tyler Beddoes stood at the edge of the Spanish Fork River, his breath forming clouds in the March air, staring at something that shouldn't have been there, a car, overturned, its wheels pointing toward the gray Utah sky like the legs of a dying animal. The fisherman who'd called it in stood nearby, his rod forgotten in his hand, his face pale with the knowledge that he'd been casting into this water all morning, not knowing what lay beneath the surface, just yards away. Someone was shouting from the riverbank, voices overlapping, radios crackling. But beneath all that noise, Tyler heard something else. It was a voice, clear and distinct, rising from inside the submerged vehicle, an adult woman's voice, desperate and pleading, "Help me." That voice changed everything, turned curiosity into urgency, transformed what might have been a recovery into a rescue, and set in motion a series of events that no one present that Saturday afternoon would ever be able to explain. The morning had started like any other Saturday in Spanish Fork, a town of 40,000 tucked into the Wasatch Range 50 miles south of Salt Lake City. Tyler had been on patrol for hours, the kind of slow shift where the biggest excitement was usually a fender bender or a domestic dispute. His radio had crackled to life around 12:20 p.m. with a report from dispatch. A fisherman had spotted what looked like an abandoned vehicle in the river near the bridge on Route 89. When Tyler arrived with 3 other officers, Warner among them, the scene looked almost peaceful. The kind of accident where you assumed everyone had walked away hours ago. The car was resting on its roof in the shallow water, partially submerged, its back end propped slightly higher than the front by the rocky embankment. From the road above, the cement barrier had hidden the vehicle completely, which explained why no one had seen the crash, despite the steady stream of Saturday traffic. But then they heard it, all of them. Simultaneously, that voice calling for help from inside the car. Tyler's feet were already moving before his mind caught up, splashing into water so cold it felt like knives cutting into his legs. The other officers were right behind him, all of them driven forward by that desperate plea echoing across the water. Officer Jared Warner would later tell reporters that the voice was plain as day. Not something imagined or hoped for, but real and urgent. The water rose to their chests as they waded closer, the current pulling at their uniforms, the cold so intense that their muscles began to seize. None of them hesitated. They reached the car and began pushing, straining against the weight of the vehicle and the force of the water, trying to rotate it enough to see inside. The voice continued, spurring them on, giving them strength they didn't know they had. "Help me, help me." The words were a lifeline, pulling them forward even as the frigid river tried to drive them back. Before we continue, leave your like, share our story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. The car wouldn't budge at first, its roof embedded in the rocky riverbed, water rushing around it in eddies and swirls. Tyler positioned himself on one side, while Warner took the other, both men digging their boots into the slippery stones beneath the surface. 2 firefighters, Paul Tomodakis and Lee Metcham, arrived and plunged into the water without a word, adding their strength to the effort. Together, the men heaved, their combined force finally beginning to shift the vehicle. Behind them on the bridge, more first responders arrived. Someone calling for a winch, someone else shouting coordinates, but Tyler barely heard any of it. His entire world had narrowed to this single moment. This one car, this voice that kept calling for help. The adrenaline coursing through his veins was laced with something else, at conviction that whoever was inside was running out of time. With one final, desperate push, they managed to tilt the car onto its side. That's when they saw her. Lynn, Jennifer Grosbeck, 25 years old, was in the driver's seat, her body limp and still, her face turned away from them. There was no question that she was gone. Lieutenant Matt Johnson would later tell reporters that the massive trauma suggested she'd died on impact, probably around 10:30 the previous night, when her car struck the cement barrier and careened off the bridge. But in the back seat, suspended upside down in a car seat on the passenger side, was something impossible. An 18-month-old girl, dressed in nothing but a flannel onesie, hung inches above the water that had been rushing through the vehicle all night. Her eyes were closed, her tiny body unconscious, her skin pale and cold to the touch. Tyler's heart, which had been racing with the urgency of rescue, seemed to stop altogether. The voice had been real, they'd all heard it, clear as a bell, but it couldn't have come from the mother. And the baby couldn't speak. One of the firefighters was already moving, pulling out a knife and sawing through the car seat straps with hands that shook from cold and adrenaline. They lifted the baby out, her small body frighteningly limp, and formed a human chain up the steep embankment to the waiting ambulance. Tyler climbed out of the water last, his uniform soaked through, his body beginning to shake uncontrollably from hypothermia. Several of the first responders would need treatment for exposure to the freezing water, but none of them cared about that now. As the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle pulled away with its tiny passenger, Tyler stood on the riverbank, water streaming from his clothes, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. The voice had been real, he'd stake his badge on it, his reputation, everything. But whose voice had they heard? The mother was dead, had been dead for 14 hours. The baby was unconscious, and far too young to form words. Yet someone or something had called to them from inside that car. The question followed Tyler back to the station, echoed in the quiet moments when he tried to warm up with coffee. That couldn't quite reach the cold that had settled into his bones. He'd been a police officer for 10 years, had seen his share of accidents and tragedies, had learned to keep his emotions in check and his faith. If he was honest, had been wavering for months. The job had worn on him, the constant exposure to humanity's darker moments, the weight of carrying other people's trauma. He'd started to wonder if there was any meaning to it all, any purpose beyond just showing up and going through the motions day after day. Now, standing in the Spanish Fork Police Department with his wet uniform clinging to him and the memory of that voice still ringing in his ears, Tyler felt something shift inside him. It wasn't just that they'd heard a voice, it was that the voice had compelled them to act with an urgency that had saved a life. Without it, they might have approached more cautiously, might have waited for equipment, might have lost precious minutes that would have meant the difference between life and death. At Primary Children's Hospital in Salt Lake City, doctors were working to stabilize the baby girl named Lily. She'd been in that frigid water for 14 hours, strapped upside down in her car seat, exposed to temperatures that should have killed her. The medical team couldn't explain how she'd survived the cold water. By some miracle, had likely slowed her metabolism enough to preserve brain function, and her position in the car seat had kept her just barely above the waterline. Her layer of baby fat and the warm clothing her mother had dressed her in had provided just enough insulation. But even with all those factors, her survival defied medical logic. By Sunday, barely 24 hours after the rescue, Lily was opening her eyes. On Monday, her grandfather Chad Groesbeck held her in his arms while she sang Wheels on the bus and watched Dora the Explorer on the hospital television. The doctors used words like astounding and miraculous to describe her recovery. There was no brain damage, no lasting effects from the hypothermia, no physical trauma beyond the immediate shock of the accident. It was as if someone or something had been watching over her throughout that long, dark night in the river. Back at the scene, investigators tried to piece together what had happened to Lynn Jennifer Groesbeck. She'd been driving home to Springville from her parents' house in Salem, a route she'd taken countless times before. There were no skid marks on the bridge, no signs of mechanical failure. No evidence of drugs or alcohol toxicology reports would later confirm this. Lieutenant Johnson suspected she might have been tired or momentarily distracted, but they'd never know for certain. What they did know was that the cement barrier had hidden the crash completely from the road, that no one had witnessed the accident, and that the car had sat in that river all through Friday night and Saturday morning without anyone noticing. If the fisherman hadn't been there at that exact time, if he hadn't looked in that exact direction, Lily might never have been found. But he did, and when the officers arrived, they heard the voice. One by one, each first responder gave their statement, and the story was always the same. An adult woman's voice, clear and urgent, calling for help. Not the cry of a child, not a sound that could be explained by wind or water or imagination, but words, "Help me." The media descended on Spanish Fork within days, transforming a small Utah town into the center of a national conversation about miracles and divine intervention. CBS, NBC, ABC, CNN, and they all sent reporters to interview the officers and firefighters, to get body camera footage, to try to understand what had happened at the Spanish Fork River. Officer Jared Warner told them, "It wasn't just in our heads. To me, it was plain as day. I remember hearing a voice that didn't sound like a child, just saying, 'Help me.'" Tyler found himself thrust into the spotlight, struggling to articulate something that felt beyond words. How do you explain to a skeptical world that you heard a voice that shouldn't have existed? That it felt as real as any conversation you've ever had? That it changed the course of events in a way that can't be dismissed? The footage from his body camera showed the frantic rescue, the desperate struggle in the freezing water, but it couldn't capture the voice. Technology hadn't recorded what every human ear present had heard. Some people online called it mass hysteria. Others suggested the officers were lying for attention, but Tyler knew the truth. They'd all heard it, and it had saved Lily's life. Lily's family released a statement a week after the rescue. Their words carefully chosen to express gratitude while acknowledging the mystery. They believed the voice had been Lynn's, that somehow her love for her daughter had transcended death itself, calling out from beyond to ensure her baby's rescue. Garrett Grossbeck, Lynn's brother, told the Deseret News, "What it should show all of us is an acknowledgement of how much Jenny loved her little girl. It was a beautiful thought, and one that brought comfort to a family shattered by loss." Lynn had been enrolled at Provo College, studying to become a medical assistant, building a future for herself and her daughter. That future was gone now, stolen in an instant by a crash no one could fully explain. But in her death, something inexplicable had occurred. Whether it was her spirit, an angel, or something beyond human understanding, the voice had ensured that Lily would survive, that Lynn's daughter would have the chance to grow up, to laugh and sing, and live the life her mother had wanted for her. Tyler met with Lily's family in the days that followed, and they thanked him with tears in their eyes, holding the miracle baby who was already bouncing back with the resilience only children possess. But Tyler found himself thinking that he should be thanking Lily. Before that Saturday, he'd been in what he'd later describe as a complete downward spiral, struggling with his faith, questioning whether his work as a police officer had any real meaning. The darkness had been closing in, the weight of too many tragedies and not enough hope. Then came Lily, and the voice, and the impossible rescue. "We rescued baby Lily that day," he would later tell reporters, "but in reality, she rescued me. And the voice rescued me and my faith." It wasn't just about hearing something supernatural. It was about being reminded that there was more to this world than what he could see and touch. That sometimes, in moments of deepest need, something reaches through the veil to help us. The experience didn't answer all his questions about God and purpose and suffering, but it gave him something he'd been missing: hope. By Wednesday, March 11th, Lily was released from the hospital into the care of her mother's family, a full recovery that doctors still struggled to explain. Her father, Devin Trafney, had rushed back from a job in Montana when he got the news. Arriving at the hospital to find his daughter alive against all odds, he was grappling with the death of Lynn, the woman he called the love of my life, while simultaneously trying to process the miracle of Lily's survival. The rescue had required multiple forces to align perfectly: the fisherman's presence, the officer's immediate response, the voice that drove them forward, the exact positioning of the car that kept Lily's head just above water, the cold that preserved her instead of killing her. Remove any single element, and the story would have ended differently. It was as if every detail had been orchestrated by an unseen hand, each piece falling into place with divine precision. The first responders who'd waded into that freezing river knew they'd been part of something beyond normal rescue protocol, beyond training and procedure. They'd been instruments of something greater. In the months and years that followed, Tyler would co-author a book with Ptolemy Tompkins called Proof of Angels, documenting the rescue and exploring what it meant in the context of faith and divine intervention. The book would become a bestseller, reaching readers around the world who were hungry for evidence that the spiritual realm was real, that angels walked among us, that death wasn't the end. But even as Tyler told the story in interviews and book signings, he always emphasized the same points. He and the other first responders had heard the voice. It had been real, and it had made the difference between life and death. He wasn't trying to convert anyone or push a particular theology. He was simply bearing witness to what had happened that March afternoon in Spanish Fork, and Lily, the baby who should have died, continued to thrive. Growing from a toddler into a healthy young girl with no memory of the 14 hours she spent suspended over icy water, no lasting trauma from the accident that took her mother, the community of Spanish Fork held onto the story like a talisman, a reminder that miracles could happen in their corner of Utah, that the divine could reach into ordinary moments and transform them. The bridge over the Spanish Fork River became a kind of informal memorial. Though no plaque marked the spot where Lynn Groesbeck's car had gone over, people would sometimes stop there, looking down at the water, trying to imagine what had happened, trying to understand how a voice could call out from an impossible place. The story spread through churches and synagogues and mosques, shared in sermons and testimonies, each retelling slightly different but always returning to the same core truth. Something beyond explanation had occurred. Whether you called it an angel, a mother's love, transcending death, or the hand of God, it had been real enough to drive 6 trained first responders into freezing water with the absolute conviction that someone inside that car needed help, and someone had a tiny girl named Lily, who would grow up knowing that her life had been saved by something miraculous. Years later, Officer Tyler Beddoes would write a second book called Puzzled, reflecting on how the rescue had impacted his mental health and renewed his commitment to policing. He stayed in touch with Lily's family, receiving photos and updates, watching from a distance as the baby he'd pulled from the river grew into an 80-year-old who loved to help others. He would tell people that she'd rescued him, that the faith crisis he'd been experiencing had been resolved not through theological arguments or religious studies, but through lived experience, through hearing a voice that shouldn't have existed, and seeing a child survive what should have been impossible. Other officers who'd been there that day reported similar transformations in their own lives, a renewed sense of purpose, a deepening of faith that couldn't be shaken. They'd witnessed something that defied rational explanation, and it had changed them in ways both profound and permanent. The skeptics could say what they wanted, could offer alternative explanations about adrenaline or auditory hallucinations or group psychology, but none of those theories could account for the perfect synchronization of events, the miraculous timing, the voice that had driven them forward with such urgency. The story of baby Lily became a parable for the possibility of divine intervention in a skeptical age, proof that the material world wasn't all there was, that sometimes heaven reached down to touch earth. It reminded people that angels could take many forms. The firefighters who cut through car seat straps with numb fingers, the officers who pushed themselves to the edge of hypothermia, the fisherman who happened to cast his line in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. And maybe, just maybe, angels could also be voices that called out from impossible places, spurring the living to save the dying, reminding us all that love, whether human or divine, was stronger than death. The rescue had taken minutes, but its impact would ripple forward through decades, touching lives far beyond that cold river in Utah. Every time Tyler looked at updated photos of Lily smiling and healthy, every time he thought about that voice calling for help, he was reminded that his work as a police officer mattered, that showing up and serving could mean the difference between tragedy and miracle. That was the gift Lily had given him, not just a dramatic rescue for his record, but a restoration of meaning to his life. In the end, faith isn't about having all the answers, it's about being willing to wade into cold water. When you hear someone calling for help, even when logic says it's impossible, it's about trusting that there's more to this world than what we can measure and prove, more to human experience than neurons firing and chemicals reacting. The officers and firefighters who rescued Lily Groesbeck that March day in 2015 didn't set out to prove the existence of angels or validate anyone's theology. They were simply doing their jobs, responding to a call, following their training. But when they heard that voice clear, urgent, undeniable, they chose to believe it was real, and that choice saved a life. Whether the voice came from an angel, from Lynn Groesbeck's spirit, or from some dimension of reality we don't yet understand, it accomplished what it needed to accomplish. It brought help, it summoned rescuers. It ensured that an 18-month-old girl named Lily would grow up to watch Dora and sing Wheels on the Bus with her grandfather, to go to school and make friends and live a full life. That's what miracles look like when they touch ground, not always spectacular displays of divine power, but quiet interventions that change the course of a single life, and in doing so, remind us all that we're never truly alone. The physical evidence tells part of the story. The body camera footage showing first responders struggling in icy water. The medical records documenting Lily's impossible recovery. The accident reconstruction showing a crash that should have been witnessed but somehow went unnoticed for 14 hours. But the real story lives in the testimony of 6 people who heard a voice that couldn't be explained, who acted on faith and instinct and sheer human decency, and who pulled a baby from the jaws of death. It lives in the life of a young girl who grew up knowing she'd been saved by a miracle, that her mother's love or an angel's voice or God's hand had ensured her survival. It lives in the renewed faith of a police officer who'd been close to giving up, who found purpose again in the least likely place, and it lives in all of us who hear this story and feel, even for a moment, that there might be more to this world than we've been taught to believe. The Spanish Fork River still flows under that bridge on Route 89. Cold and grey, and ordinary to anyone who doesn't know what happened there. But for those who were present that March afternoon, for Lily's family, for everyone touched by this story, that stretch of water is holy ground, a place where heaven and earth met, where the impossible became real, and where a voice called out from beyond to save a child's life. This account rests on extensive documentation from major national news sources including CBS News, NBC News, ABC News, CNN, the Deseret News, and Utah's KSL television station, all of which reported on the rescue in March 2015 and the mysterious voice heard by first responders. The story was further detailed in the 2016 book Proof of Angels by New York Times best-selling author Ptolemy Tompkins and officer Tyler Beddoes. One of the rescuers, published by Simon & Schuster. Lily Groesbeck's recovery and the testimony of the 6 first responders remain a matter of public record, preserved in body camera footage, hospital reports, and the unanimous statements of those present at the Spanish Fork River. On March 7, 2015, the facts speak for themselves, as do the lives forever changed by what happened that day.